The magnetic lock on the primary glass doors of Sentinel cryptography flashed a harsh, unforgiving red. I tapped my encrypted founder's keycard against the reader a second time. The digital panel beeped twice, a flat electronic rejection indicating that my master administrative credentials had been permanently revoked. It was 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. When you are the sole founder and primary software architect of a rapidly scaling data encryption startup, a localized system failure is an annoyance. But when your master keycard is completely wiped from the mainframe of the building you personally lease, it is never a technical glitch. I did not hammer my fist against the reinforced glass. I did not call my head of security to scream about a system error. When I simply pulled my smartphone from my tailored blazer pocket and opened my secure administrative dashboard. The screen buffered for a fraction of a second before an automated priority alert from the Delaware Division of Corporations populated my inbox. Urgent filing. Change of executive control and registered agent ratified for Sentinel Cryptography. LLC. Certificate of merger formally executed and verified at 7:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. My brain bypassed emotional shock and immediately shifted into the cold, clinical architecture of a forensic audit. I had coded the foundational quantum-resistant algorithms from a cramped apartment 5 years ago. I held 80% of the voting shares. My parents, Thomas and Eleanor, held a combined minority stake of 10%. An early seed investment I had gifted them strictly for their retirement. Whilst minority shareholders cannot legally execute a corporate merger, they cannot sign an asset purchase agreement, they cannot sell a company unless they completely bypass the founder. A second email arrived. It was an automated notification from a premier corporate escrow firm routed to my secondary address. Transaction complete. Meridian Tech Holdings acquisition of Sentinel Cryptography finalized. Escrow successfully funded with $30 million. Primary disbursement scheduled to authorized proxy, Julian Ventures. They had not just attempted to sell my company, they had successfully closed the deal. Meridian Tech Holdings, a massive, aggressive data conglomerate, had just paid $30 million for my life's work, and the funds were already sitting in a holding account controlled by Julian, my younger brother, Julian, the golden child. With a 30-year-old aspiring crypto entrepreneur who had burned through 3 different startups, entirely funded by my parents' enabling wealth, and currently owed massive sums to private commercial lenders, I did not call my parents to demand an explanation. Noise and hysteria are the exact currencies that guilty people rely on to manipulate a narrative. I operate entirely on paper. I walked back to my car, opened the secure lockbox in my trunk, and extracted a rigid plastic folder. Inside were the physical certificates of my corporate formation, my original operating agreement, and, most importantly, a thick sealed legal binder containing my federal intellectual property assignments. I waited in the parking lot until a junior developer arrived and propped the glass door open with his coffee cup. I slipped inside my own headquarters. The polished lobby was buzzing with an unfamiliar, aggressive corporate energy. Men and women in tailored suits wearing Meridian Tech visitor badges were actively measuring the floor space and auditing the desktop terminals. The acquisition transition team was already executing the hostile takeover of the physical space. I bypassed the reception desk without a word and walked straight toward the primary glass-walled boardroom on the executive floor. There they were. My mother, Eleanor, was standing near a catered breakfast spread, holding a crystal flute of champagne, laughing warmly with 2 Meridian executives. My father, Thomas, was sitting at the head of my mahogany boardroom table, projecting the deeply unearned authority of a triumphant CEO, and Julian was leaning casually against the floor-to-ceiling window, and he was wearing an absurdly expensive designer suit, tapping away on his phone, looking at my life's work as if it were simply a piñata that had finally burst to fund his next delusion. Eleanor saw me first. She did not flinch. Her face instantly arranged itself into a mask of weary, maternal condescension, the exact expression she used whenever she needed an audience to believe I was being unreasonable. She set her champagne down and walked toward the boardroom doors to intercept me before I could step inside. "Valerie, darling," Eleanor sighed, pitching her voice loud enough so the Meridian executives could hear a calm, rational mother dealing with a volatile daughter. "There is absolutely no need for you to storm in here looking so dramatic. We were going to call you from the celebratory brunch. The deal is officially done. Meridian is thrilled with the acquisition." I stopped walking. I did not raise my voice to match her theater. I looked at Julian's exotic car keys resting on the mahogany table, then back at my mother. The sheer, suffocating audacity of her tone hung in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the executive suite. She had just admitted to orchestrating a multi-million-dollar corporate heist in the tone of a woman explaining a slight change in dinner plans. Thomas stood up from the head of the table, crossing his arms with a manufactured sigh of impatience. "Let us not turn this into a legal production, Valerie. We executed the sale for the benefit of the entire family. Julian's decentralized finance platform desperately needed the initial coin-offering capital, and traditional venture capitalists were being completely unreasonable with him. He deserves this liquidity. You are a highly capable woman. You will simply build another software company. You always do." Julian finally looked up from his smartphone, rolling his eyes as if my presence was a minor administrative inconvenience. "Honestly, Valerie, you were holding on to the equity way too tightly. The Meridian buyout was a massive premium. I need the capital to scale my platform. It is a family investment. I do not know why you are being so defensive and selfish about a simple exit strategy." They actually believed that sharing a bloodline granted them absolute immunity from federal corporate fraud. They believed my $30 million tech firm was just a shared family piggy bank that they could smash open to cover Julian's failures. "How exactly did you bypass the primary shareholder consent, Thomas?" I asked. All my voice as flat and heavy as a vault door. "I hold 80% of the voting equity. I did not sign an asset purchase agreement." Thomas offered a cold, patronizing smile. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded document printed on heavy legal stock. "You think we would initiate a 6-month acquisition negotiation without a safety net?" Thomas whispered, his voice dropping so the Meridian executives could not hear him. "You signed a comprehensive operational proxy during the Series A funding round 3 years ago. We simply activated it due to your extreme executive burnout. And we utilized your digital DocuSign credentials to finalize the transfer while you were off-grid at that developer conference last weekend." I did not blink. My mind simply accelerated. They had not just bypassed a boardroom vote. They had committed federal wire fraud and synthetic identity theft to digitally forge my signature on a $30 million acquisition. I looked past my father entirely. Sitting at the far end of the mahogany table was a sharp, unsmiling man in his late 40s, methodically reviewing a thick stack of printed contracts. He was not a transition manager. He was David Sterling, the lead M&A corporate counsel for Meridian Tech Holdings, the man who had actually authorized the $30 million wire. I walked past my parents without a single word and stepped directly up to David Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice carrying cleanly across the sudden silence of the boardroom, "what exactly did Meridian Tech purchase this morning for $30 million? David Sterling looked up from his paperwork, on his brow furrowing slightly at my cold, procedural tone. "We purchased 100% of the outstanding shares, digital assets, and physical infrastructure of Sentinel Cryptography, LLC, Ms. Valerie. The escrow has already cleared." I unzipped my rigid plastic folder and placed my physical driver's license flat on the polished mahogany. "I am Valerie, the primary founder and sole engineer of Sentinel Cryptography," I stated cleanly. "I want you to open the executed asset purchase agreement on your terminal, and I want you to pull up the intellectual property asset schedule." David hesitated for a fraction of a second. his corporate instincts suddenly detecting a massive, unseen liability in the room. He tapped his spacebar, waking up his encrypted laptop. He clicked a secure tab. He's scrolling down through the dense legal framework of the merger document until he reached the final annex, the intellectual property schedule, the core lifeblood of any tech acquisition. Now, I instructed calmly, open the United States Patent and Trademark Office Digital Registry. Search for the primary quantum encryption patents that power the software. Show me the intellectual property transfer. David tapped his keyboard, pulling up the federal database. He typed in the core patent registration numbers listed in the contract and hit enter. The screen buffered for a fraction of a second. David stared at the result. The polished, commanding demeanor of a veteran corporate attorney evaporated instantly. He froze, his hand hovering completely still over his computer mouse. He slowly turned the laptop screen toward me, and his eyes wide with absolute institutional terror. "Miss Valerie," David whispered, the silence in the boardroom becoming suddenly suffocating. "The Federal Registry says that Sentinel Cryptography, LLC, does not own a single proprietary quantum encryption patent, algorithmic copyright, or cryptographic key." David Sterling finished, his voice dropping into a hollow, breathless rasp, completely stripped of its usual polished corporate cadence. He stared at the glowing federal database on his monitor, his eyes darting frantically across the registration fields. The legal assignee listed on the United States Patent and Trademark Office Registry was not the corporate entity his conglomerate had just paid $30 million to acquire. It was my personal name. "Correct," I stated. My voice slicing through the heavy silence with flawless, unhurried precision. "I am the sole inventor and architect of the software. I filed the foundational patents and registered the core intellectual property under my individual name 2 years before Sentinel Cryptography was ever formally incorporated. I never assigned the intellectual property to the LLC." David's jaw tightened so hard I could hear his teeth grind. He was a veteran M&A litigator, and he instantly recognized the catastrophic, radioactive architecture of the trap he was currently sitting in. "You merely licensed it," David murmured, his hands trembling slightly as they hovered over his keyboard. "I granted the LLC a standard, revocable, non-exclusive, and strictly non-transferable commercial license to utilize the software for daily operations," I confirmed cleanly, resting my hands perfectly still on the polished mahogany table. "Which means Meridian Tech Holdings did not just buy a $30 million cybersecurity firm, Mr. Sterling. You bought a floor of leased office furniture, 60 heavily depreciated developer laptops, and a break room espresso machine. You bought an entirely empty corporate shell." Thomas's face flushed a violent dark red. His survival instinct kicked in, and he immediately tried to pivot his narrative, desperately attempting to salvage his heist through sheer volume and patriarchal intimidation. "That is absolute technical nonsense," Thomas shouted, slamming his hand down on the mahogany table, trying to forcefully reclaim the room. "We sold the entire company. The code is physically sitting on the local servers right down the hall. We own the physical servers. Which means Meridian owns the product. Valerie is just trying to complicate a finalized deal out of sheer spite." David Sterling slowly looked up from his laptop. He did not look at my father with the deferential respect of a corporate buyer. He looked at him with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Are you functionally illiterate, Thomas?" David hissed, his voice vibrating with a sudden lethal corporate fury. "Having the physical code on a server without the federal patent license does not make Meridian the owners. It makes us active participants in massive corporate intellectual property theft. If my engineering transition team boots up those servers right now, Meridian Tech Holdings will be instantly liable for billions of dollars in federal copyright and patent infringement." Eleanor let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The crystal flute of champagne slipped through her manicured fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp, echoing shatter. The condescending matriarch who had just called my arrival dramatic completely dissolved into sheer, paralyzed terror. Julian finally pushed himself off the glass wall. His designer suit suddenly looked entirely absurd on his frame. He stepped forward, his eyes darting wildly between the Federal Registry on the laptop and his parents. "Wait, Julian stammered, his voice thin, reedy, and devoid of his usual golden child entitlement. "The $30 million is already in my holding account. The Meridian escrow cleared exactly 45 minutes ago. You cannot undo a finalized commercial wire. The deal is closed." I turned my attention entirely to my younger brother. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the massive weight of the federal legal system crush the oxygen out of his lungs. "The deal was executed under fraudulent representations and warranties, Julian," I explained, listing the facts like I was reading a grocery list to a stranger. "Your parents signed an asset purchase agreement containing a formal schedule of assets, swearing under penalty of perjury that they possessed clear, unencumbered title to intellectual property they never legally owned." I looked back at the lead attorney. "How exactly did they pass your initial intellectual property due diligence, David? I am assuming they uploaded documentation to the secure Meridian data room during the audit phase." David swallowed hard, slick with cold sweat. He typed furiously to access the encrypted M&A data room. "Thomas uploaded a digitally certified USPTO assignment of invention document during the discovery phase. It was a formal federal transfer sheet proving you had permanently surrendered all personal patents to the LLC 3 years ago." I unzipped my rigid plastic folder a second time. I pulled out a heavy watermark document featuring a raised blue seal and placed it flat onto the mahogany table directly next to my physical driver's license. "This is a certified abstract of title directly from the Federal Registry, printed yesterday afternoon," I stated smoothly. "I have never transferred the patents. Thomas and Eleanor fabricated a federal intellectual property assignment document. They forged a United States government seal and my signature to trick your M&A team into authorizing the $30 million wire." The ambient hum of the central air conditioning was the only sound in the boardroom. David Sterling went completely pale. The polished corporate attorney vanished, replaced instantly by a man staring at the absolute destruction of his own career and the immediate, terrifying reality of a massive federal crime. "That is not a simple contract dispute," David whispered, his voice shaking violently as he stared at the forged documents. "That is a Class 2 federal felony. That is wire fraud, corporate securities fraud, and the digital forgery of United States government documents." Julian's chest began to heave visibly. The reality of the federal boundary finally broke his delusion. And he was not in a trendy decentralized finance incubator where he could pitch his way out of a bad investment. He was standing in the epicenter of a $30 million federal crime scene. David did not wait for my parents to offer another pathetic excuse. He snatched his smartphone off the table, dialing his primary corporate banking liaison with brutal speed. "I am locking down the Meridian corporate treasury," David announced cleanly, his eyes locked onto Julian. "And I am initiating a Level 4 federal fraud recall on the primary escrow account right now. That $30 million is going to be frozen before you can even log into your portal." Julian's face instantly drained of all color. He looked like he had just been physically struck. He stumbled backward, bumping heavily into the glass boardroom wall. "You cannot freeze the escrow," Julian whispered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic croak. David stopped dialing, his thumb hovering over the screen. "Excuse me." "You cannot freeze the escrow holding account," Julian repeated, tears of absolute, unfiltered panic suddenly spilling over his expensive designer frames. "Because the $30 million, it isn't sitting in the commercial bank account anymore." What do you mean the $30 million is no longer sitting in the commercial holding account, Julian? David Sterling asked, his voice dropping into a dark, razor-thin whisper. He was no longer speaking as a corporate buyer negotiating a minor closing detail. He was a veteran M&A litigator staring into the abyss of a massive capital flight event. Julian's chest heaved audibly, and his survival instinct completely overwhelmed by the crushing gravity of the room. He looked at his parents, his eyes wide and pleading for the enabling rescue they had always provided, but Thomas and Eleanor were completely paralyzed, slick with cold sweat, watching the federal trap snap shut around their golden child. I needed to secure the initial coin offering for my decentralized finance platform immediately, Julian stammered, his voice thin, reedy, and vibrating with unfiltered panic. I had a massive liquidity gap with my early-stage investors. The second the $30 million Meridian wire cleared into my holding LLC at 7:15 this morning, I executed a hard transfer. David's jaw tightened so violently I could hear his teeth grind. You executed a hard transfer of $30 million within 45 minutes of closing? Where did you route the capital, Julian? I didn't leave it in the traditional banking system, Julian whispered, the words catching painfully in his throat as the absolute magnitude of his actions registered. Commercial banks place arbitrary holds on massive liquidity events. I routed the entire principal through a high-speed institutional cryptocurrency exchange. I converted the fiat currency into unregulated offshore stablecoins and pushed the wallets to my private creditors to satisfy my margin debt. The ambient, polite hum of the central air conditioning was the only sound in the sterile executive suite. The silence was dense, heavy, and absolute. Julian had not just stolen $30 million, he had taken a massive and federally tracked corporate acquisition wire and instantly laundered it through an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange, completely anonymizing the capital and pushing it entirely beyond the reach of standard domestic banking recalls. He thought he was being an aggressive, visionary tech founder securing his empire. He had actually just committed international money laundering and massive federal wire fraud before breakfast. David Sterling did not yell. He did not slam his fists on the mahogany table or threaten a civil lawsuit. He simply picked up his encrypted corporate smartphone and dialed a direct, unlisted number with brutal, mechanical precision. "This is David Sterling, lead counsel for Meridian Tech Holdings," he stated smoothly into the receiver, his eyes locked entirely on Julian. "I am initiating an immediate, Priority 1 escalation with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I need to report a $30 million fraudulent acquisition wire that has just been illegally converted and offshored into an unregulated digital wallet." Eleanor let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The polished, condescending matriarch who had just called my arrival dramatic, completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her expensive designer suit suddenly looked absurd on her trembling frame. She stumbled forward, her manicured hands reaching desperately toward the corporate attorney. "Mr. Sterling, please!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice cracking into a high-pitched sob that echoed off the glass walls. "Please, hang up the phone. Julian did not understand the legal structure. He's just an ambitious entrepreneur. He did not know his father forged the patent assignment. This is a massive family misunderstanding." "A family misunderstanding?" I repeated, my voice slicing through her rising hysteria with surgical precision. "You bypassed the primary shareholder of a $30 million technology firm using a fabricated operational proxy. You forged a federal United States Patent Office document. You conspired to sell a corporate shell while actively hiding the intellectual property ownership. And you handed the liquidity to a 30-year-old child who immediately laundered it offshore. The fact that the system caught you does not mean you are innocent, Eleanor. It simply means you are mathematically incompetent." Thomas forcefully pulled his arm out of his frozen posture, his face flushing a violent dark red. He abandoned his desperate, He cornered silence and rushed toward the mahogany table, instantly adopting the booming, authoritative tone of a patriarch attempting to forcefully manage a subordinate. "David, wait!" Thomas shouted, slamming his hand down next to the forged federal documents. "Do not call the federal authorities. We can structure a repayment plan. We will liquidate our domestic real estate portfolio. We own 10% of Sentinel Cryptography. We will sign over our entire minority equity to Meridian right now to cover the damages." "You do not possess any equity in Sentinel Cryptography, Thomas," I stated, my voice slicing through his rising panic with absolute authority. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks, staring at me in paralyzed shock. "What are you talking about? We own 10%. We signed the initial operating agreement 5 years ago." I unzipped my rigid plastic folder a final time and placed a heavy, notarized corporate document flat onto the polished mahogany. "3 years ago, you forged my digital DocuSign credentials to secretly execute the operational proxy that allowed you to sign this fraudulent merger today," I noted smoothly, my enunciation flawless and unhurried. "But you were so entirely focused on funding the Golden Child's fake crypto empire that you failed to audit the foundational operating agreement of my software company." Thomas stared at the crisp, watermarked paper, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Sentinel Cryptography operates under a strict, impenetrable founders clause regarding minority shareholders," I explained. "When, if any, minority shareholder attempts to unilaterally execute a change of control, merger, or asset sale without the explicit physically notarized consent of the primary founder, their equity is instantly and permanently dissolved back into the corporate treasury. It is a standard poison pill defense against hostile internal takeovers. The moment you electronically filed the fraudulent certificate of merger at 7:15 this morning, your 10% stake legally evaporated. You possess absolutely zero leverage to offer Meridian." Thomas's jaw dropped. He had just annihilated his own retirement portfolio to fund a federal felony. Julian finally pushed himself off the glass wall. His designer suit suddenly looked entirely absurd. He stepped forward, his eyes darting wildly between the Federal Registry on the laptop and me. "Valerie." "Ah, please," Julian begged, his voice devoid of any arrogance. He looked at me with the unfiltered terror of a man realizing his digital empire was built entirely on radioactive quicksand. "If Meridian reports the wire fraud, the SEC will permanently freeze my decentralized finance platform by noon. They will seize my physical servers. I will lose everything. My investors will destroy me. You have to sign the patent transfer. Assign the intellectual property to Meridian today, and the entire sale becomes legally valid." "I am not going to commit a Class 2 federal felony to retroactively legitimize your $30 million corporate heist," I replied evenly, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored blazer. "And I am certainly not going to surrender my proprietary code to cover your catastrophic offshore gambling debts. Especially not this code." Julian froze entirely. "What do you mean?" "The foundational patents I hold for the quantum-resistant encryption software are not sitting dormant, Julian," I explained, listing the facts like I was reading a technical manual. 3 months ago, I quietly signed an exclusive, multi-year federal licensing contract to integrate my algorithms directly into the United States Department of Defense Secure Communications Grid. The color drained entirely from David Sterling's face. The veteran M&A litigator slowly lowered his smartphone, the sheer devastating magnitude of my words paralyzing his analytical pacing. "You licensed the software to the Department of Defense?" David whispered, the silence in the room becoming suffocating. "Yes," I confirmed cleanly. "Which means the code sitting on the physical servers right down the hall is currently classified as restricted, military-grade federal infrastructure." I turned my attention entirely to my father, my voice as flat and heavy as a steel vault door. And Thomas just sold physical access to those restricted servers to an unauthorized third-party commercial holding company, I stated calmly, while forging United States government documents. A sharp, jagged gasp echoed across the boardroom. Thomas realized instantly that he had not just committed corporate wire fraud. He had anchored his own signature to a massive, catastrophic breach of federal national security. And then, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite pushed open with a sharp, violent thrust. The heavy glass doors of the executive suite pushed open from the outside with a sharp, violent thrust, instantly cutting off the ambient noise of the corporate transition team in the lobby. 4 individuals stepped into the room, 2 uniformed federal marshals acting as physical perimeter control, and 2 plainclothes special agents wearing dark suits and tactical ID lanyards emblazoned with the Department of Defense Criminal Investigative Service insignia. The lead agent did not ask the Meridian executives who was in charge. He walked purposefully toward the massive mahogany table, bypassing my trembling parents entirely, and stopped directly in front of David Sterling. Thomas's survival instinct kicked in immediately. He abandoned his paralyzed, cornered posture and turned rapidly toward the federal agents, I instantly adopting the smooth, persuasive tone of a concerned, wealthy patriarch attempting to manage a minor service error. "Agents, thank goodness you have arrived," Thomas stammered, his hands raised in a gesture of practiced diplomacy, forcing a tight, anxious smile. "This is a terrible, escalating corporate misunderstanding. My daughter, Valerie, has been dealing with severe executive burnout. We merely secured a temporary operational proxy to ensure her software assets were protected during a standard commercial acquisition. She is confused regarding the intellectual property schedule and is aggressively litigating a finalized merger." The lead agent did not shake Thomas's extended hand. He did not even look at him. He looked directly at the lead M&A counsel for Meridian Tech Holdings. "I am Special Agent Cross, Department of Defense," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly hum that demanded total, immediate compliance in the room. "We received an automated priority escalation from the secure federal communications grid, corroborated by a direct digital fraud report filed by the primary patent holder regarding the unauthorized commercial transfer of restricted military-grade infrastructure." David Sterling stood perfectly still, his veteran corporate composure completely dissolving into pure, institutional self-preservation. He was actively severing himself from the radioactive transaction in real time. "I am David Sterling, lead counsel for Meridian Tech Holdings," David replied, his voice echoing with cold, uncompromising authority. "The man currently speaking to you just presented a forged corporate proxy and a fabricated United States Patent and Trademark Office document to illegally execute a $30 million acquisition of Sentinel Cryptography, LLC. Meridian was completely unaware that the primary algorithmic architecture residing on these physical servers is federally classified." Thomas's mouth opened, but the smooth, diplomatic words died in his throat. A sickly, pale gray washed over his face as the absolute magnitude of the trap registered. He was not simply facing a domestic civil lawsuit from an angry daughter. He had orchestrated a $30 million capital flight event involving restricted national defense technology. I stepped forward, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored blazer. I did not raise my voice to compete with my father's lies. I simply tapped the heavy, watermarked federal abstract of title resting on the mahogany table next to my physical driver's license. "My name is Valerie," I said calmly. "The intellectual property schedule my father submitted claims I formally surrendered all proprietary patents to this corporate shell 3 years ago. This certified document is a time-stamped registry extraction from the USPTO, proving I am the sole, individual owner of the cryptographic algorithms. My parents forged a federal government seal to execute a corporate heist, and in doing so, they attempted to grant an unauthorized commercial entity physical access to restricted Department of Defense infrastructure. Agent Cross looked down at the physical, unredacted corporate documents. He looked at the forged federal assignment bearing the raised blue ink. He did not need a tearful confession or a dramatic breakdown. He had a mathematical, geographical, and federal impossibility. He turned his attention back to Thomas. "Sir," the agent said, his tone devoid of any sympathy, his posture entirely rigid. "A family financial dispute is an argument over equity percentages. A notarized federal forgery used to attempt a $30 million commercial acquisition of classified military servers is a Class 1 felony under the National Security Act and an active violation of the Espionage Act." Eleanor let out a piercing, breathless gasp. The condescending matriarch who had told me I could simply build another software company completely dissolved into sheer terror. "We did not actually take the physical code," she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "The massive wire transfer went straight to our son. We didn't even know she had a military contract. You cannot arrest us for trying to secure a simple exit strategy for our family." "Ma'am," Cross replied, his posture entirely uncompromising, "you successfully defrauded a massive technology conglomerate using a fabricated United States government document bearing your explicit signature. The fact that you were entirely ignorant of the national security implications does not legally erase the federal forgery." The boardroom fell dead silent as the sheer, devastating weight of the federal jurisdiction crushed the oxygen out of the room. Julian finally broke completely. He stood frozen by the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, clutching his smartphone like a lifeline to his vanishing digital empire. And the 30-year-old golden child suddenly looked absurdly small in his designer suit. "Wait!" Julian begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic sob. "I can return the liquidity. The $30 million is parked in an offshore cryptocurrency wallet. I can convert the stablecoins back into fiat currency right now. I will wire it directly back to the Meridian escrow. Please, I am an early-stage founder. My investors will destroy me if the SEC freezes my decentralized platform." David Sterling slowly closed his laptop with a sharp, definitive click. The veteran corporate attorney looked at Julian with unfiltered, lethal disgust. "You cannot return the liquidity, Julian," David stated, his voice slicing through the golden child's hysteria with surgical precision. "Because the $30 million you illegally converted and offshored was flagged by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network the second it hit the unregulated exchange. You did not just commit wire fraud. You committed massive international money laundering." Julian stopped breathing entirely. "And Julian," Agent Cross added, his voice a flat, uncompromising line of federal authority, "when a United States citizen utilizes an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange to launder $30 million generated from the fraudulent sale of restricted military infrastructure, the federal government does not ask for a refund. We initiate a hard, multi-agency asset seizure." Julian's face instantly drained of all color. He looked like he had just been physically struck. He stumbled backward, bumping heavily into the glass wall. "In seizure," Julian whispered, his voice shaking violently. "You cannot seize a decentralized wallet. I hold the private cryptographic keys." "We do not need your private keys, Julian," I noted smoothly, my enunciation flawless and unhurried. "Because the federal authorities do not target the digital wallet, they target the domestic off-ramps." I turned my attention entirely to my younger brother, my voice as cold and heavy as a steel vault door. "The moment the SEC formally freezes your decentralized finance platform," I explained, listing the facts like I was reading a technical manual, every single domestic commercial bank linked to your corporate entities will immediately lock your accounts to comply with federal anti-money laundering regulations. Or you cannot convert those offshore stablecoins back into usable fiat currency without triggering an immediate arrest at the banking level. You are holding $30 million in digital monopoly money that you can never legally touch. A sharp, jagged gasp echoed across the boardroom. Julian realized instantly that he had not just stolen $30 million. He had permanently anchored his own digital empire to a massive, radioactive federal crime scene. "Agent Cross," David Sterling said cleanly, pointing to the forged federal documents resting on the mahogany table. "The physical evidence of federal forgery is currently in your possession, and Meridian Tech Holdings is formally pressing maximum federal charges." Agent Cross did not hesitate. He picked up the heavy and forged federal assignment document and slid it cleanly into a rigid plastic evidence folder. The ambient hum of the corporate boardroom dissolved entirely as the true, devastating weight of the federal jurisdiction crushed the remaining oxygen from the room. He smoothly unholstered a pair of heavy, matte black steel handcuffs from his tactical belt and stepped directly toward Thomas. "Thomas and Eleanor," Agent Cross stated, his voice a low, gravelly hum that demanded total compliance in the high-end suite. "You are under immediate federal arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, synthetic identity theft, the digital forgery of United States government documents, and active violations of the National Security Act regarding restricted cryptographic infrastructure. You have the right to remain silent." Thomas took half a step backward, slick with a cold, pale sweat. The booming, authoritative patriarch who had arrogantly attempted to sell my life's work simply buckled. "I am a prominent commercial investor," he stammered, looking at the federal agents like they had forgotten his place in society. "I demand the immediate right to call my personal corporate attorney." "You will have plenty of time to call your counsel from the federal holding facility, Thomas," Cross said, gesturing cleanly for the uniformed marshals to step forward. The mechanical ratcheting sound of the steel cuffs echoing off the high acoustic ceilings was the most definitive sound I had ever heard. Eleanor let out a piercing, breathless shriek as a second marshal approached her. She did not fight. Her knees simply gave out entirely, and the officer had to physically hold her upright by her elbows. On her tailored designer suit wrinkled instantly, her perfect arrogant mask completely destroyed in front of the Meridian executives she had just been sipping champagne with. Julian watched his parents being physically restrained, his face slick with cold sweat, trembling violently against the glass wall. The 30-year-old golden child, the aspiring decentralized finance visionary, was entirely paralyzed by the sheer terror of his own exposure. He clutched his smartphone against his chest, desperately hoping his digital empire would somehow insulate him from the physical reality of the room. Agent Cross paused, turning his cold, analytical gaze onto my younger brother. "And Julian," Cross added, pulling a second pair of steel cuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for international money laundering and the unauthorized receipt of fraudulent federal funds. The SEC, in coordination with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, is currently drafting a comprehensive, multi-agency asset freeze targeting every single domestic and offshore financial entity connected to your name." "No!" Julian shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched sob. He dropped his exotic car keys and his encrypted smartphone onto the mahogany floor. "The $30 million is offshore. I didn't forge the patents. I just took the wire. I am an early-stage founder." "And you laundered it through an unregulated exchange to evade domestic banking compliance," Cross replied cleanly, securing the heavy cuffs around Julian's shaking, manicured wrists. "Your private creditors are currently being subpoenaed, and your domestic holding accounts are frozen. Your startup is officially dead." I watched the federal marshals actively escort my parents and my younger brother out of the heavy glass doors and toward the executive elevator. I did not feel a sudden emotional rush of triumphant joy. I just felt the quiet, steady relief of a closed system functioning exactly as designed. David Sterling turned to me, his veteran corporate composure slowly returning now that the radioactive liability had been physically removed from the room. "Valerie," David murmured, looking at the certified federal abstract of title still resting on the mahogany table. "The Meridian acquisition of Sentinel Cryptography, LLC, is officially dissolved. We are immediately recalling our transition team from your headquarters. The $30 million escrow wire is now a federal fraud loss that our legal department will aggressively pursue directly against your brother's offshore entities and your family's remaining domestic assets for maximum restitution." "Understood, Mr. Sterling," I replied evenly, placing my physical driver's license back into my rigid plastic folder and smoothing the lapels of my tailored blazer. "And the physical servers?" "Meridian will not touch a single line of your classified code," David confirmed rapidly, terrified of triggering an Espionage Act violation. "We want absolutely nothing to do with this military infrastructure. You have complete, unencumbered operational control of your facility." I nodded once, zipped my folder, and walked out of the boardroom. Then 3 weeks later, the federal paper trail finalized their absolute systemic ruin. The Department of Justice did not offer a plea deal for forging United States Patent Office documents to sell classified military infrastructure. Thomas and Eleanor were formally indicted on multiple Class 1 felony counts. The aggressive legal retainer required to keep them out of pretrial federal detention completely drained their retirement savings and forced them to aggressively liquidate their entire real estate portfolio at a massive loss. Julian's decentralized finance platform imploded in less than 48 hours. The moment the SEC flagged his offshore conversion of the $30 million Meridian wire as active money laundering, every single domestic bank linked to his accounts executed a hard freeze. Now, without access to the traditional banking system to off-ramp his $30 million in offshore stablecoins, his private creditors violently foreclosed on his margin loans, seizing his exotic cars and his luxury penthouse. He went from a tech bro visionary to a terrified, broke 30-year-old sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial for international money laundering. Meridian Tech Holdings filed a devastating civil lawsuit against my parents for the $30 million escrow fraud, ensuring they will spend the rest of their lives buried under an inescapable mountain of corporate debt. I fired the entire Meridian transition team from my physical building, reset my master administrative credentials, and finalized the Phase 2 integration of my cryptographic algorithms into the Department of Defense Secure Communications Grid. I filed a permanent ironclad restraining order against my entire family, and a federal judge granted it without hesitation. They thought they could forge my signature, steal my life's work, and sell my company to fund the golden child's delusions. But they sold an empty corporate shell, completely forgetting that the real power always resides in the intellectual property. And my patents were bulletproof. If your own parents forged federal documents to secretly sell your multi-million-dollar tech company to fund your siblings' lavish lifestyle, would you have pressed maximum federal charges, or would you have simply let them keep the money to maintain family peace? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Then if you enjoyed this story of absolute paper trail justice, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. See you in the next video.